Hi, everybody. Welcome to the Blue Economy CRC's webinar series for 2025. For those that don't know me, I'm Professor Chris Fried. I'm the program leader of the Environment and Ecosystems program within the Blue Economy CRC, and my part-time job is professor at Griffith University. I want to begin by acknowledging the First Peoples of Australia, traditional custodians of the lands and seas on which we work and play. Pay my respects to Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander peoples participating in this webinar and acknowledge their custodianship of our lands and seas for the last 65,000 years, while also recognising that no treaty has been signed and sovereignty has never been ceded. So with that formal acknowledgement and recognition, welcome to the CRC's webinar series. I know many of you are frequent flyers and hopefully you're accumulating bonus points as a result of that. But for those that are new to us, the Blue Economy CRC was established back in July 2019 with a 10-year lifespan under the Australian government's CRC program. We have 43 active participants in the collaborative research program, and the CRC's aim is to perform world-class collaborative industry-focused research and training that underpins the growth of the blue economy through increased offshore sustainable aquaculture and renewable energy. And the vision for the Blue Economy CRC is to support Australia's blue economy industries in developing offshore sustainable seafood and co-located renewable energy that are globally competitive at the forefront of innovation and underpinned by robust environmental planning and management frameworks that consumers can trust and value the products. With that in mind, today's webinar is around the topic of integrated planning for Australia's marine estate, a pressing need, and how marine spatial planning might be able to support it. In this webinar, we're looking at possible approaches to overcoming the challenges that have been identified through the growth and emergence of new sectors, while also recognising the importance of existing sectors to our national economy. In discussions with our partners and the wider community, the need for a holistic and integrated approach is regularly raised, and what we're seeking to do today is focus on how integrated governance can be developed and learn from both what's going on in Australia and what is happening internationally. So for more information on the Blue Economy's specific marine spatial planning project, there's a QR code on your screens at the moment, and I'll draw attention to the fact that we are literally just launching 3 draft documents. They're draft in the sense that they're consultation, not that they're full of typos. There's a lot of work that's gone into removing the typos. And these constitute the emerging marine spatial planning, Australian marine spatial planning framework. So after this webinar, when you're looking for something to do, please follow through, have a look at those documents and provide us with feedback. Today, I'm very pleased to say that we are joined by 3 presenters who are come from very different perspectives on this challenge of providing integrated and holistic management. Dave Rissik is from BMT, a international marine consulting company that works with a wide diversity of clients from multiple sectors. He's previously worked at Deloitte for the National Climate Change Research Facility, NCARF, led a range of projects in recent decades concerned with climate change risk, maritime spatial planning and maintenance management projects for a variety of clients. David's work has related to climate change, spatial planning, and projects at all levels of government in Australia and across the Pacific. He's an accomplished workshop facilitator, he really should be doing my job, and project manager, and has led multiple multidisciplinary teams from across agencies and from across partnerships. David is a non-executive director of the Green Cross in Australia, a not-for-profit organisation supporting Australian business, industry and community to increase their resilience in the face of climate change. Secondly, we'll have Finn Davis from New South Wales DCCEEW. He predominantly works on marine estate management and governance. He has a policy background, in communications research and environmental science, and again with a special interest in marine conservation and the management of shared marine resources. And for a truly international perspective, we're joined by Paul Gilliland from the Marine Management Organisation in the United Kingdom. Paul has over 30 years experience in managing and protecting marine resources, working for a number of government agencies in the UK. Since 2021, he has helped set up and lead a new strategic renewables unit with a focus on offshore wind, and he heads up the marine planning department at the Marine Management Organisation, a role he's held for over 10 years. He led the development of the first marine plan in the UK, which was one of the first in the world, has worked with partners in the European community in terms of developing their approach, and he's overseen the production of 5 other marine spatial plans for regions around England. So that's the panel. Each panelist will make a short presentation, and we will then have an open Q&A. So please, as we go through the presentations, drop any questions you have into the Q&A box. You should see a link at the bottom of the screen. But also please vote for questions, that you want to support, because I will be managing the Q&A by looking at which questions have accumulated the most support. So please, in addition to raising any questions you have, please feel free. I encourage you to vote on questions that have already been posted. So now, without further ado, and only slightly behind time, I'm going to ask Dave Rissik to give us his presentation. Dave, over to you.
Thanks very much, Chris, and good afternoon, everyone. So it's the scariest part of the afternoon when I try and share my screen. So let's hope, I assume that it's showing up, Chris. So I've got a long, excellent. I've got a long title of the presentation. If I had to really put it into what I'm focusing on, I'd say making integrated planning decisions in the marine space is a real challenge. Can marine spatial planning help? And hopefully we will answer that as we go through mine in the following presentations this afternoon. So if we look through what I'll talk about briefly about why marine spatial planning matters, some of the broad objectives for marine spatial planning, a little bit of what the current regulatory landscape looks like, and that's pretty high level overview there, not many details. Some of the benefits of marine spatial planning. I have a brief case study of the Netherlands Marine Spatial Plan that can pull out the usefulness of a plan that's been done and being implemented. And then finally talk a bit about the challenges and the enablers for marine spatial planning. And that actually, I think, leads nicely into the following 2 presentations, which get to a little bit more detail about some of these things. So why marine spatial planning matters? I guess a few years ago, I ran a project for the Blue Economy CRC looking at policy and regulatory research plan for the organization. And we did a range of stakeholder surveys. And a lot of these issues that can be challenged or solved by marine spatial planning came through from the work that we did. A lot of feedback about the complexity of Australia's marine jurisdiction, Commonwealth versus state versus local government, the associated uncertainty with existing policy and legal environment that we face in different states and different parts of the country, who owns what, who's responsible for what. This really translates into a pretty challenging permission system, particularly when you start to think of different things that go on at the same places. So those co-located activities are really challenged by that. As we look forward to a greater demand for space in the marine zones, we get more demand for conservation, more demand for fishing grounds, and aquaculture, energy raising its head and really becoming a strong focus in many parts of the country, the need for shipping, the need for defense space, and obviously tourism. And this growing demand for space means that there's greater challenges between those different sectors. And there really is a need for better coordination across those sectors, but also across the different jurisdictions. All of this translates into who's going to pay for some of these things, particularly as we move into areas such as energy, where there needs to be greater investment, agriculture as well, and the need for investor confidence, which is often eroded when it doesn't look like anyone has their act together in terms of what is able to be done and where. And the increasing need for our thinking processes to be forward-looking. With climate change coming on at a rate of knots, we really do need to have plans that are looking forward to how we change them into the future, how we manage those, how we manage emerging industries, and do those in an effective way. Part of our work that we did, we made a range of different recommendations around marine spatial planning to the CRC. Some of them have been taken on by Chris, and he's already advertised the work and hoping that people give feedback to his draft documents. So I think that's a really great opportunity for everyone to do that, and I'd encourage people to put their efforts into giving feedback. It helps to improve all the products that are done. And I think there's still more work that needs to be done to underpin, hopefully, when we move into better marine spatial planning around the country. So there's a range of different reasons why one would do marine spatial planning. In some parts of the world, it's very much focused around conservation of marine ecosystems, but it is different to marine parks, and we need to remember that. And it's not only for conservation, but it does help conservation in a very strong way. Essentially, very important is that objective of sustainable use of marine resources. So that need to balance economic activities and make sure that we are doing that sustainably and in the right places. Its objective is often around conflict resolution, as we get more and more people jockeying for positions, jockeying for space, jockeying for what they need to do for their business or for their own objectives. We need some way of ensuring that there's conflict resolution, and marine spatial planning can actually achieve that in many cases. In some cases, it's still challenged by that. The need for integrated coastal zone management. This is something that's been tried to be being done around the country for a long, long time. And our coasts continue to be very complex and dynamic areas. And that obviously interaction with the ocean is so important. And marine spatial planning can help us there. Obviously, planning and zoning are critical elements of this. But one of the really important things about marine spatial planning and the objectives of it is to bring all the stakeholders that matter together and ensure participation in the planning process. And that's really, really critical and probably be talked about a bit more in my talk, but in the others as well. And of course, as I've said before, that whole issue of a future climate that we need to adapt to, and marine spatial planning objectives are often focused around that. How do we set up something that helps us have that future look? In Australia, we do have a very complex regulatory structure with the three levels of government, all of which different regulations, many challenged by internal differences in regulations and different purposes from different organizations. And those different responsibilities often mean that there's different ways in which decisions are made, and those overlaps and implications within agencies and between agencies are often seen as big challenges, particularly by some of the proponents of different activities in the marine space, who often will remark about the fact that nobody seems to really know what's going on. And there really is a need for a coordinated policy framework across all levels of government, and help with that complexity of navigating those different levels. And of course, there's often focus on sector-based approvals, where the approvals are done in a very specific, narrow way and aren't thinking outside of those particular areas. And that does also cause challenges and consternation with proponents of work. Of course, these are complicated. It's not really a regulatory thing, but because of the sector differences, because of all the differences that we do notice, and the lack of coordination, there is that conflict between the different users who try and really focus on their own needs. And that's, I see, as a real complicator of that whole regulatory landscape. When we think about how we can get around that and the benefits of doing it, we often hear the need for marine spatial planning as a nirvana. If we had a marine spatial planning, it would solve everyone. It would help us lead towards that other nirvana, which is a one-stop shop for approvals and addressing that policy and regulatory complexity. Hopefully, Paul can show us that it's possible when he gives his presentation in a little while, but it does seem really challenging. And I'll talk through the case study of the Netherlands in a moment. Benefits include better risk management and conflict resolution. If there's a bit more certainty, you start to be able to work through some of those challenges of conflict much more easily, and also can help to develop some of those risk management approaches. Cumulative impact assessment is becoming more important, and if we have an integrated marine spatial plan and all the information that underpins it, it really starts to help that cumulative impact assessment being done. We can start to think about multi-use zones that balance the needs of conservation, but also help streamline sustainable development and use of the marine system, which is, as we've talked about before, continually getting driven for more to come out of it. And of course, another benefit is that informing that adaptive management to address the issues of climate change. So the case study of the Netherlands has a fairly tiny marine spatial zone and the whole area of 58,000 square kilometers of the Netherlands is covered by their marine spatial plan. When you compare it to Australia's greater than 8 million square kilometers of marine zone, it's a lot easier for them, but it is still quite an interesting one to look at. They've got a plan that's in place from 22 to 27, which replaced the previous iteration of it. And really the aim of their plan is to get the balance right and ensure efficient and safe spatial development in the North Sea that fits with the preconditions of having a healthy ecosystem. They're addressing a whole range of different marine uses in that plan, and you can see, don't try and look at the detail on the right-hand side, but you can see in a small spatial scale like that, you can really get specific and detailed zonings in place that can help manage some of the challenges and opportunities in that environment. And those are some of the different conflicting uses that they have. It's interesting to look at the types of decisions that have been made based around the fact that they have a marine spatial plan, because it starts to show one that's actually in operation and being used for achieving the objectives. And certainly they've used it for wind energy assessments and planning. They've used that to strengthen the marine ecosystem protection and therefore the outcomes that are achieved there. They've used it to coordinate some of the multiple uses that are in that identified in the marine zone and the pressures that are on that for greater use. And they've used it to develop and implement a range of different policy and assessment frameworks. And those frameworks have been really helpful in terms of trying to develop and support their decision making. But it's not all beer and skittles, I guess. They still have challenges. There's a number of strengths in that they have very clear areas for offshore wind designations, for example, and increasing the renewable energy drive is very important to them. It's been very strong in achieving interministerial coordination. It's a data-driven and adaptive planning process, which is very important and underpins it all. And of course, they've got quite a strong level of ecosystem-based zoning and protection associated with it. Some of the challenges that they've faced, however, and continue to face, are that fisheries are still not fully integrated. There is still conflict between the fishing community and fishing sector, where wind, for example, is taking over in some areas where the fishing folks still believe they should be having access to and have had access to traditionally. There are no implementation plans at the moment for restoration. And so it's not as forward-looking as some would like. There are still challenges with that integration between land and sea, which is we've mentioned previously. And some of the complex trade-offs that have been required, have had to be made, haven't been fully communicated. So while there has been great engagement, it hasn't gone as far as some would have liked. But all in all, I think it's a really positive and useful plan to look at. So I guess some of the challenges of marine spatial planning, they can be, you can have a marine spatial plan, you can still have issues with policy and regulatory alignment and engagement if they aren't set up right from the start. And if you don't have the right coordination mechanisms, and there can still be fragmented responsibilities. So those really need to be addressed early on when you start to deal with these, with developing up marine spatial plans. Some of the challenges can be if there's unclear aims of the marine spatial planning tools and the program outputs, so that stakeholders aren't clear where what's actually out to be achieved. And when you get that misalignment between people's expectations and what's delivered, it becomes important. It becomes an issue. We have challenges, and you can imagine in 8 million square kilometers of marine space that we have in Australia, the difficulty in obtaining data that's accurate, applicable, and that's sufficient, and that it covers all the way areas, social, economic, and environmental, that are required for preparing a decent marine spatial plan. There is a need for updating data, and that's expensive and challenging in its own right. The stakeholder engagement's imperative, and there are challenges with getting that done without conflict, and determining who to engage in the process, how much engagement is required, and how do you continue that on? How do you motivate your local communities to participate, to engage with the marine spatial plan, align with it, use it, work it, and access the information? How do you communicate and coordinate aligned marine spatial planning actions across different jurisdictional boundaries? So again, that whole issue of dealing with the local, the state, and the federal boundaries and different legislation. There's a lot of human knowledge and skill gaps in spatial planning. So there might not be the capability within different parts of society to drive some of these plans to the level that they need to be. And then, of course, all these tools need to be updated regularly as new and emerging information comes along, as we get new and emerging users coming along and uses. And this is really important in the marine zone, where it often seems that government's a little bit behind where industry and business is driving. And so it's quite difficult for them to stay ahead and instead of following. So some of those enablers for success or reaching that pot of gold at the bottom of the ocean, we really need to consider connectivity and movement in the marine environments, because these things do cross jurisdictional boundaries. So we need alignment at all those state, national, and international jurisdictions. There really is a need for clear governance frameworks and legislative alignment as well, and that will help to enable success. We need to have accessible and also trusted spatial data sets. We need really excellent stakeholder engagement in Australia. We need strong traditional owner engagement to ensure that we get a marine zone that delivers what all of society want, and that reduces conflict because we haven't cared enough about particular stakeholders. There's a need to consider funding for the long term. It's not a project. It's becomes something that needs to be in place for long periods of time. And that also requires that cross-agency collaboration and long-termism from them. And of course, then really important, something that often falls off is we need well-developed and well-funded monitoring and evaluation processes so that if these marine spatial plans aren't working, they can be adjusted and they can still deliver the outcomes that everyone wants from them. If we get that right, we can really achieve something really positive. And I might leave it there and pass back to Chris. So thank you very much.
Thanks, Dave. And we'll move swiftly on to Finn.
Thanks, Chris. Can I just check that everyone can see my slides okay? Wonderful, wonderful. Well, thank you so much, everyone. I am not going to be discussing marine spatial planning, but I will be discussing the integrated marine governance approach in New South Wales, because the state has been pursuing collaborative governance between New South Wales government agencies under the Marine Estate Management Act since about 2014. Moving right along, this is the New South Wales Marine Estate. We have the most populated coastline in Australia, and 82% of the population live close to the coast. There's incredible diversity from north to south in terms of coastal and marine species. And the Marine Estate extends from the Queensland to Victorian borders, from the high tide mark out to 3 nautical miles offshore, including everything affected by the tides, essentially, shoreline, submerged lands, even coastal lakes and estuaries. There was identified a need for a more integrated and comprehensive management approach, and that the Marine Estate Management Act 2014 is the New South Wales government attempt to address it, and it aligns with and works with the Biodiversity Conservation Act, the Coastal Management Act, and the Fisheries Management Act. So the Marine Estate Management Act establishes a shared responsibility between the Minister for Environment and the Minister for Agriculture. It provides for management of the marine estate in a manner that promotes a biologically diverse, healthy and productive marine estate, maintaining ecosystem integrity and facilitating economic, cultural, social, scientific and educational use. In order to do this, it promotes coordination of public authorities in relation to the marine estate and provides for the management of marine parks and aquatic reserves. And specifically in terms of that coordination, it establishes the Marine Estate Management Authority, MEMA, which consists of an independent chair and senior executives from the Departments of Environment, Fisheries, Planning, and Transport. MEMA is also supported by a Marine Estate Expert Knowledge Panel, the chair of which also sits on MEMA. And the Act also requires that MEMA develop a comprehensive threat and risk assessment for the marine estate and a marine estate management strategy that is in part meant to realize the objects of the Act and also intended to address those threats and risks to the marine estate and its values. So MEMA has these core functions, which I won't go into too much detail right now. Suffice it to say, I have just addressed them, and crucially, they're also obliged to promote collaboration and coordination between public authorities in the exercise of their functions relating to management of the marine estate. So MEMA is a collaborative body with collaboration between agencies as its purpose. And you know, the governance framework is an attempt to escape from the previously siloed management of matters relating to the marine estate that we had under the previous policy settings. The Marine Estate Management Authority operates under a vision that they have drafted of a healthy coast and sea managed for the greatest well-being of the community now and into the future, which means a marine estate with clean and safe waters, biologically diverse and resilient ecosystems that's accessible to the community to maximize economic, social, and environmental benefits, and where key community benefits are maintained and enhanced for current and future generations. So you can hear the alignment with the objectives of the Act there. Supporting the vision are these 10 underpinning principles, which I won't read through. You can see them here. But the principles are attempting to respond to the fact that the marine estate is largely an open access resource, that management resources are limited, that multiple benefits are derived from the marine estate, that knowledge gaps and uncertainty about ecosystems exist, and also knowledge gaps about threats and the effectiveness of management. And finally, that management should be efficient, transparent, and accountable. And to support these underpinning principles and sort of capture them, MEMA has adopted an iterative decision-making process whereby community benefits and threats are identified, they are assessed in terms of their risk to threats are assessed in terms of their risk to benefits. Current management is assessed to see where the gaps are, and then we develop and implement management responses to priority threats. We monitor, evaluate, and report, and then we return to step one. Here's a quick timeline of New South Wales marine estate policy over the past few years. So we had the Marine Estate Management Act coming in 2014. Shortly after that, MEMA was established and they published their principles paper, Managing the Marine Estate. After that, they moved swiftly on to developing the threat and risk assessment framework for the New South Wales marine estate, which was used to produce the 3 background reports on community and stakeholders' views, environmental threat and risk assessment, and social and cultural and economic threat and risk assessment. And all of those went into the final statewide threat and risk assessment, which you can see there, which fed into the New South Wales Marine Estate Management Strategy, which was established in about 2018. And we're capturing data on the marine estate and how the strategy is affecting it through the Marine Integrated Monitoring Program. So you can see in just sort of 4 short years, we were able to establish quite a comprehensive response to the need for more integrated governance approach. This is a quick sample of just how thorough the TARA was. I will not go into too much detail for it here, but you can see that it was quite a granular breakdown of specific threats to specific assets. You can see the environmental, the assets running along the top, along the x-axis, and then you can see the activities or threats that may threaten them down the y-axis, and you can see that each cell sort of uses a traffic light system to indicate the level of threat that was estimated by the TARA. It's a topic that we could have a whole presentation on its own. The TARA then, as I said, fed into the Marine Estate Management Strategy, which contains 9 management initiatives, 53 management actions, and close to 100 individual projects being delivered across 4 government agencies. It's secured long-term funding for the first time up to June 2028. And you can see here that the management initiatives are arranged around assets and threats. So water quality, for instance, was identified as one of the greatest threats to the marine estate. So it's initiative 1. We're also addressing climate change, cultural access for Aboriginal communities, outcomes for threatened and protected species, sustainable fishing. It's supported by the Marine Integrated Monitoring Program to monitor how it's affecting the condition and trend, fill key knowledge gaps, and assess effectiveness, which I can talk you through here. The MIMP, as we call it, is we have a single kind of integrated monitoring framework, and then that's supported by the environmental condition framework and the my apologies, and the New South Wales Marine Estate Community Wellbeing Framework. We have a dedicated MIMP team within DPIRD Fisheries, and formerly a MIMP steering committee, which has now been combined with the Marine Estate Agency Steering Committee, which you can see here in this map, which gives you an idea of just how extensive the governance framework for the marine estate is at this stage, now that everything has been established. So you can see the Marine Estate Management Authority sitting up there, supported by the Marine Estate Expert Knowledge Panel, the Marine Estate Agency Steering Committee, and then MASC oversees implementation of the key marine estate programs. So marine parks, the Marine Integrated Monitoring Program, the Marine Estate Management Strategy, and oversees those initiatives there that are being delivered by project leads and initiative leads, and you can see that the membership of MASC roughly mirrors the membership of MEMA. And if you would like to find out more, you can head to marine.newsouthwales.gov.au. Thank you very much.
Thanks very much, Finn, for that perspective from New South Wales. Just a quick reminder to people to post questions in the Q&A tab. And now moving on to our final presenter, Paul Gilliland from the Marine Management Organisation in the UK. And Paul has kindly postponed his breakfast this morning to be joining us. So over to you, Paul.
Thanks, Chris, and good morning, everyone, from a rather warm and increasingly sunny UK. I must admit, I find it very odd not being able to see who I'm speaking to, but I hope you're all well. Yeah, confession, Chris, I actually have had some breakfast already and tea. There must always be tea before this time of the day. So it's interesting. David said, look, it's challenging. And my view is, yeah, it is. But if it was easy, it probably wouldn't be needed or would have been done by now. So the overall title for the webinar is about integrated planning in Australia and what's the role of marine spatial planning. And most countries that are interested in integrated management usually end up at some point going, oh, there's a tool missing in the toolbox, and we call it marine spatial planning. So that means moving, as both David and Finn have said, from a siloed approach to a more joined up approach to different interests, which is easy to say, but it's harder in practice. So I'm going to make some points which actually David and Finn have made, but that's no bad thing to reinforce commonalities. But hopefully I'll add to that based on experience and learning from trying to do it mainly in England, but I will refer to some other countries. And I've organised the talk around the why, the what, the who, and the how, focus particularly on setup and process, given where I understand MSP is in Australia, although I've just learned from Finn that actually one or two places are a little further along than I thought. So thank you for that. Next slide, please. So a quick word about my sponsor, who I work for. This is the Marine Management Organisation, and I was thinking, Finn, actually there's some similarities between MEMA and the MMO, some differences too. We don't just do marine spatial planning. For example, we do marine licensing for quite a lot of activities. We do fisheries management. A couple of points to pull out, and I will try and pull out a few points that I think of particular relevance to your situation as I go along. We are a public body under the Department for Environment, Food and Rural Affairs. That includes fisheries. That's because DEFRA have traditionally for decades tended to have the marine brief in England. So we're funded by public money, grant and aid, although we get permitting fees and project funding. And the other point I would pull out is that although we sit under DEFRA for the purposes of governance and funding, we do a lot of work with them on behalf of other government departments who deal with energy and minerals and transport and what have you. And that's the theme that I will keep coming back to, and also fits with the point David kept making about coordination and the complex regulatory landscape. Okay, next slide, please. So I had in the back of my mind as I was looking at this, how you set up marine planning. The figure on the left is from the UNESCO guide to declare an interest. I was on the advisory group that led to production of this document. And thinking about some of the building blocks, and we use this in some of our work elsewhere. For example, we've been doing some capacity building in Senegal and the Turks and Caicos, and every country that thinks about marine planning then has its own take on this. And there you are on the right is some of the work that Chris and colleagues have been doing with some of you. So bear these in mind as I draw out some of the lessons as we go along. But one point I would make, you can always learn from other situations. We did that in the early days. But context is king and queen and prime minister and president and what have you. You always have to translate from somewhere else into your particular context. And I just make that caveat right up front. Next slide, please. So it's always good to start with why. In the UK, but actually also in many of the countries in Northwest Europe, we arrived at the need for marine spatial planning largely because of the increasing and competing use of the sea, leading to conflicts between different interests, but also impacts on the ecosystem, leading to inefficient decision making and quite contentious cases getting locked up in long public inquiries, etc. But it is important to ask who is actually asking for marine planning. So in the early days, the criticism sometimes be, oh, it's just the environmentalists asking for it. Now, I come from an environmental background. I used to work for the government's Nature Conservation Agency, and I got involved in marine planning because I led casework for many years, and I kept seeing, whether it's ports or aggregate extraction, oil and gas, whatever, dealing with all of those separately, but seeing the same receiving environment being impacted by this. And also, it was always a reactive consideration of the environment through EIA and not a proactive consideration. So that's what first brought me to marine planning. But the important point in the UK context is lots of different interests across the sustainable development equation from economy and social and environmental were interested in pushing for it. So David mentioned about stakeholder engagement. A lot of coastal communities and their representatives in local authorities felt they were disconnected from decision making at sea, what was called the democratic deficit. They said, we want to be more involved in that. Quite a few industries said, look, we need a bit more certainty about where we're going. What really pulled the trigger for, was the catalyst in the UK, was the arrival of the new kid on the block, offshore wind, which needs a lot of space. And suddenly it was like, oh, that's really persuaded people that we've got to do something different here. The other thing I would say is, as a result of that broad constituency of advocates, it also had cross-party support when it went through our parliament to put the legislation in place. So what is it? Well, there's the UNESCO definition. We've got our own version of it in England, which seems to resonate more with people. And one of the things I'd like to emphasize on this is it's not just about where, but it can be also when and how. So yes, something might happen in a particular space, but actually the plan also talks about how it should happen, what the conditions that go with that. And that's something people sometimes seem to think, oh, marine spatial planning, so therefore it's just a zoning scheme and it's just spatial. No, it can be more than that if you choose for it to be. Next slide, please. So one of the things that you therefore have to understand is, well, what's different to what we did before? So here's the siloed approach, which again, David and Finn mentioned. Now we're taking this integrated approach. And what does that actually mean? What's different? Because that then actually has quite a bearing on what we need to do and plan for. So it's really got three characteristics for me. It boils down to this. So it's about taking an integrated approach. So it's across all interests. So in the marine plans in England and the UK, we encompass everything from biodiversity to offshore wind to heritage to everything. You're looking across all aspects of sustainability, of sustainable development. And you do that, the text in green is the positive, is the benefits. You do that by looking at a particular place. And that's how you go, right, we'll look at this place, we'll look at everything in it. But the challenge of that is, wow, so I'm interested in everything. That's a lot of evidence. So I don't just want to collect the evidence and where the habitats are, but I need to understand the economy. I need to understand how those two things interrelate. And one of the things I would say is that means you are presented with the challenge of how do I prioritize what I spend my money on in terms of evidence, and a lot of partnerships and a lot of going around with a small amount of money in your back pocket and linking up with other people. The second aspect, which David particularly I thought brought out well, is if you're not thinking about the future, you're not doing planning of any kind. And so you need to think about what's my vision, my objectives, but also the analysis, forecasting and scenarios. And that means you have a more strategic and anticipatory approach. You're trying to preempt issues further down the line. You're trying to save some of the pain that comes in the permitting part of the process. But that gets you into things like not just data, but aspirations, politics. At the end of the day, government, on the behalf of their citizens, define what are the objectives for the future. And then you get into national versus local politics. And of course, the future is uncertain. Some sectors can forecast in 10 years. Some don't know what they're doing in 10 months. And yet you have to try and get a handle of that. And then finally, it's a public process. Now, that's very, very context specific. David mentioned the Netherlands. For reasons I still don't fully understand, in the Netherlands, their citizens generally trust the government. Doesn't always go that way in the UK. China does marine spatial planning very well, but they do things differently there, including the way they do stakeholder engagement. So it is very context specific. But if you're going to do it in the way that we do in the UK, and I sense you do in Australia, then you're dealing with a lot of different interests, including often more than the usual suspects in marine management, and that takes a lot of effort. Next slide, please. So you have to set it up in some way. There needs to be some sort of framing. So this is the way it works or worked in England and the UK. So when we were in the European Union, we're not now, but when we were, the European Union uses what's called the directives as the bit of their legal mechanism for trying to get a common approach across all the different members of the EU, the Netherlands and Ireland and Denmark and France and what have you. And that's quite important because if you're wanting to get some join up whilst respecting that the marine planning is the competence of individual states, then you need to have some commonality, some principles, and what have you. Now, for us, actually, it's made relatively little difference because our legislation, which is in the next box below, was already in place, and to be honest, influenced quite a bit what went into the European legislation. But the conclusion drawn in the UK and in England was we can't put a marine planning system in place without making it statutory. And I know that's an active debate in Australia, but that was the conclusion we drew here. And that's the conclusion drawn in many of the countries in Europe and indeed in many of the countries that have marine spatial planning. And I do wonder how any country can really deal with the challenges they've got in a complex regulatory context without making it statutory. But there you are, that's just my view. So the Act also created the MMO. And that's important because every country that does marine planning faces the decision of if we're going to do it, where do we put the responsibility? In England, they said, right, we think every existing organization's got baggage. They, you know, my former employers will mainly focus on nature conservation. So they created a new organization to do it, the Marine Management Organization. Other countries, for Germany, for example, the federal government, they gave it to the equivalent of their Maritime and Coast Guard agency that deal with shipping. In South Africa, it's a central government part that does it. So it's a choice you face, and you know, pays your money, makes your choice, and there are pros and cons to the way you do it. But that is something that you will need to face, and that's the approach we took in England. In Senegal, for example, unusually, that's one of the few places. Actually, I'll come back to that point later about cross-government working. We then have a policy level within our systems. The Marine Policy Statement is a UK document, and it says, "Dear everyone that's interested, this is what all the governments in the UK in every sector thinks important about the marine area." It's a pretty high-level document, but it is a policy statement. But alongside that, we do have national policy statements for particular sectors. And what marine plans do is they take those policy statements and they translate them into marine plans in particular places, taking account of stakeholder engagement and detailed policy and spatial guidance. And the planning authority in England is the Secretary of State. That's our minister effectively for DEFRA. But what they do is they give most of the work to the MMO. So we are the marine planning body, but we don't sign off the plans. That goes back up to the minister. But the important point is they're doing that on the behalf of all of government. So all the other government departments have an interest. And then very importantly, and I can't emphasize this point enough, the legislation also says, yeah, that's not the end of the story. You now have to use the plans. And the plans aren't just used by the MMO, they're used by all the public bodies that make decisions in the marine space. So that's part of, we have this strategic document, now everybody make decisions in accordance with it. I won't go through all these acronyms, but LPAs is the local planning authorities on land, whose remit goes down to mean low water mark. We have the Transport Ministry in there, we have local harbour authorities. So everyone is supposed to be making decisions in accordance with the marine plan and other documents that they have too. Next slide, please. So a bit where and when. Just for scale, that area in green there on the top right, that's the same size as the Dutch sector of the North Sea, 58,000 square kilometres that David mentioned. So we have technically 11 plan areas, but we coupled the inshore and offshore together, and stakeholders said, don't be daft, just do that together. So we actually have 6 marine plans around the coast. We have a distinction from England, Scotland, Northern Ireland, Wales, which is the diagram bottom left, and then everyone else around us is doing it too. So there's the countries on the right. Now, boundaries are important up to a point. So they're often already defined. We have national borders. So when we get to the border with Scotland, we leave things to them. I don't get involved in that. But within England, we had these subdivisions into regional areas, which are based on biogeography and economy and what have you. Some people get vexed that the border between the green and the blue, it could move slightly. There comes a point where you have to stop investing in defining the boundary and talk about working across the boundary. Because if you shift a boundary, what you do is you create another boundary. And I used to get very, very vexed about the boundaries. And there comes a point where we've largely settled on it. Let's get on and do something and then deal with the cross-boundary issues. And I can't emphasize that enough. And then what you do across boundaries with other jurisdictions is dependent on your situation. Do you communicate? Do you consult? Do you cooperate? Do you decide to work together? And we have various means to do that. So in the North Sea, or rather the whole of UK, we have a Regional Seas Convention. But to be honest, most of the practical note swapping on marine planning in the North Sea is done in an informal group, and that's a cooperation group. Next slide, please. Thank you. So everybody goes through a process. Everyone has their own version of a marine planning process. In your situation, this is ours. Just a couple of points to emphasize. The step at the top is where we go out to stakeholders and we consult them on how they wish to be consulted and engaged throughout the process. And that's a really important point in your process, because it's your chance to demonstrate how you mean to go on, to start how you mean to go on. And we lay out for everybody what to expect, when to be engaged, and so on. One of the things that in the early days we found quite odd is that we really had to explain to people that this wasn't a stitch up, that we hadn't already written the plan, that we're generally going on a journey, and we ended up having to invest quite a lot in that messaging. It is rarely linear, which is why there are some feedback loops, but also it goes back round. Once you've got a plan, you review, and if you need to update it, which we're about to do with our first plan, then away you go. On the right, I just wanted to highlight something that, again, it touches on something David said, which is what you're doing cuts across different government departments, different sectoral interests. So how do you organise that? For the last plans we produced, we had a cross-government board, so it wasn't just DEFRA, it was defence and transport, etc., who we then worked to, such that when it then came to official sign-off in government, there were no surprises. It kind of worked. But there's only so much that a small agency can do with central government departments. And this is one of the biggest things to try and tackle in marine planning, is how do you work across different government departments and different interests? Next slide, please. I'm nearly there. So there's a very simplified version of that process, but you start with government policy, because at the end of the day, plans, however much I care about them, is just a means to an end, and there are other means in place to that end. You then do a lot of work on evidence. An example, for the last set of 4 plans we produced, we had 60 commissioned evidence reports, as well as data gathering, etc. A lot of engagement. What I would say on engagement is you have to analyze and organize it. You have to think about the different stakeholders. You have to think about how would we interact with them. Some people are okay coming to meetings. Somebody wouldn't go anywhere near a meeting. You've got to go meet them in their own situation. But one point that a phrase I use a lot, and again, David highlighted this, is the process is as important as the product. So we run often large multi-stakeholder workshops, and we deliberately ensure there's a mix of different interests on tables. Just hearing those conversations brings understanding between people. That doesn't necessarily equal something in the plan, but it is part of the benefit of the process. And then out of that comes a plan. Now, I sort of focus in this talk on the setup and the process, given where you are, rather than the content of the plan. if you put Explore Marine Plans and MMO, you can go and have a play of this system, bottom right, where you can actually view the plans and interrogate them, and there are interactive maps. But a couple of points to highlight. One is we were asked to do a lot of signposting in the plans. That is, signpost to existing regulations already, because a lot of stakeholders go, oh, I don't know anything about mineral regulation. I didn't realize that was already done. But on top of that, we then have plan policies which cover interests like offshore wind or biodiversity, and they indicate areas that are either preferred. There's very little complete allocation in the plan. It's about shortening the odds, but often it's we're not saying no one else can go into an area, but you've got to meet some conditions or show you can coexist with a preferred interest. Final slide, please. So I thought I'd just pull out, and again, I'm happy for these slides to be shared afterwards, a few thoughts. But in thinking about when to set this up, you've got to start with why, and ask who's asking for it, what will convince government, have we got broad support. In setting up an authority, you need to think, do we need legislation? Will there be a public body? And in terms of who's doing it, who's doing the work, but who actually is responsible for signing it off? There may well be other strategic initiatives in play. Compared to 5 years ago, we now have the Energy Department creating new bodies who are doing planning for grid infrastructure, or doing what's called a strategic spatial energy plan. There's quite a lot of overlap with marine planning, and that on the one hand is an opportunity, on the other hand it's a complexity. Do you need to do it everywhere, especially given the size of your jurisdiction? And if you do you need a sort of hierarchy? So we've got this national document, then we come down to the regional level. Boundaries are important, but don't sweat it too much. Things will take time, and part of the challenge is stuff changes around you. You know, they've been, I think, 6 new governments in the time that we've working on the marine plans. That really changes the context. One of our plans got held up for 18 months because of changes in ministers. There's lots of evidence. You've got to have to prioritize. Engagement is resource heavy, but it's worth it. And bear in mind, you're in for the long haul. Those cycles, those political cycles come and go, civil servants come and go. So one of the things that really surprised me is you think you've made the case, and then you have to remake the case. Then a new bunch of people come along, you have to remake the case whilst also trying to keep the show on the road. If someone said to me, what are the things you wish you'd understood better when you started out, it would have been, you're going to need to re-articulate the case. That's why I've put identifying the need in red. And also governance, and particularly the way a government works. Working across different government interests is actually in some ways more challenging than sorting out the evidence or sorting out engagement. Thank you.
Thanks very much, Paul and Dave and Finn. I appreciate we're running a little bit behind time, so some of you in the audience may need to move on to other things, but we will have a short Q&A now. I'll remind you that we will be releasing or posting the recording of this in the next couple of days. So if you do need to leave, then you'll be able to catch up through that means. So first question that's I've got here was originally posted by Heavy, and it's: considering that governments often move slower than industry, what practical steps can be taken to strengthen cross-jurisdictional governance and to ensure long-term funding for marine spatial planning, especially in the Australian context, requiring traditional owner engagement, but also that of fast-paced offshore developments? So who wants to have the first crack at that one?
There's a lot in there. I guess for me, the biggest challenge is how do you get that long-term support and funding to make sure this happens. I mean, Paul's gone through with 6 levels of 6 changes of government, and you're still there. That's quite amazing. And when you think from an Australian perspective, because our governments often chop and change direction radically and don't necessarily support these things as strongly as they probably should. Going forward, and I think that your establishment of governance, the strong governance just around it, and that bipartisan support is just so critical. And even that you mentioned means you have to write business case after business case after business case. So yeah, I don't know the answer, but I think that it's got to be in really establishing a really strong long-term view and strong support from across government, and then having the right funding in place to make it happen at the scale and the intensity that it should. I'll pass to Paul to make comment, because I think he's got practical experience here.
Yeah, I had hair when it started, and look what it's done to me. So the Act came in 2009 under a Labour government, and then a few months later it was a different government. The fact that it had cross-party support and the fact that it was in legislation really helped. What immediately then happened was, well, the economy's bust, so suddenly what we're trying to achieve is different, and planning is a means to an end at the end of the day. So government can change the ends, but I think that really helped. Is it had cross-party support and it was in legislation. Of course, governments can change legislation, but it becomes much more harder than well, it's just a project we decided to do, and now we're going to cut it. Also, for us, because we had 6 plans in effect, it was a program, and the idea was it's a 10-year program, and you're producing roughly 2 plans every year, 2 years, and so there was a bit of a commitment to there's a long-term project here. What happened at the end of the 10 years is a different matter, and the last 3 years has been a bit of fun, but that also helped.
Okay, thanks. So I'm just going to pick up on one from Joe, who's asked, how can marine planning be regulated to effectively include non-direct stakeholders such as health departments in order to address questions such as national food security and public health outcomes? And which we could expand that to include not just, well, marine planning. It doesn't have to be marine spatial planning. So New South Wales might want to chip in on that one.
I'm sorry, Chris. I was replying to another question in the Q&A chat. If you could just repeat it, that would be great.
Yeah. Okay. So the question was how can marine planning, so not just marine spatial planning, so other integrated process, be regulated to effectively include the non-direct stakeholders such as health departments, so that issues such as food security and public health outcomes, which have a dimension associated with the marine environment, are also included.
Wow, that's a big question that I'm not confident I'm qualified to answer well. Certainly, I think that the main way that New South Wales has tried to tackle that problem is by really carefully mapping the cultural and social benefits that people derive from the marine estate, which obviously, I say obviously, I think it's established that those social benefits that people get from, thriving environments, opportunities to participate in the community activities that they might undertake in the marine estate, those are connected to health outcomes. I don't know that that connection has been made explicit in the New South Wales policy approach, but certainly we're very invested in improving those cultural and social outcomes for people. And obviously, when we're working on the environmental outcomes that the strategy is trying to address as well, we're always aware that there's also a connection between human health, well-being, and the environment's health and well-being.
Okay, thanks, Finn. I'm gonna. Sorry, Paul. I
was just going to say there are some interests. It is difficult to get tangible marine plan, but we do have policies on social aspects, and what we also have to do in our system is undertake what's called a sustainability appraisal, which is essentially sets the exam question for the issues you're dealing with. Is this the most sustainable solution? And that includes reviewing the proposed content of the plan against social as well as environmental and economic criteria.
Okay, thanks. Given time, I'm going to do one more, but I'm going to cheat by rolling 2 questions in together. So Shannon asked specifically to Paul, what was the thing that got MSP over the line in your part of the world? But I'm going to roll that in so that others can join in as well by picking up on Simon's question about Australia's historically state-led approach to doing planning. What are the political or institutional triggers that you believe could realistically lead to the adoption of a national framework in the next decade? So they're both there about what do you think what are the things that might trigger a fundamental change in the way we do things?
Okay, very quickly, through the 2000s in particular, a lot of different interests were going. It's getting busy, or the environment's getting affected. As I said, what persuaded government to look at it seriously, and they did a pilot project first to then shake out what to put in the legislation, was the arrival of offshore wind. And you could say that's the same in the state of Massachusetts, in the Netherlands, in Denmark, and what have you. The fact that the same challenges and the same opportunities, if you like, pertained in all parts of the UK also helped get it over the line in terms of it becoming a UK bit of legislation under which there is then a Scottish subset, and resulting in a marine policy statement that is for the whole of the UK. And before I hand over to David and Finn, that's where the different parts of the UK said it is in our interest to say some things together. And then we will reflect those things in our own context, in our own way. And so it's about identifying that it's in our interests. We've got some common interests that we'd like to write down, whilst respecting that you then move on to your own context.
Yeah, I guess I don't know when we're going to end up having a national marine plan that crosses the jurisdictional boundaries. I don't know if it's even possible. I think we need to have I think we need to aim at it. With climate change, parts of Queensland are becoming parts of New South Wales, and you know, things are moving, and we need to be managing these systems as a whole, and really understanding the challenges as a whole to have a sustainable future. And I think that the greater pressure that's going to be put onto the marine estates for new industries, for new emerging things, and the growing populations means that we're going to have to get our act together and do something. And whether it's just through agreements between different governments, and having consistency in the way that we all approach them from different states and at a Commonwealth level, I don't know, but it definitely needs to be done. And I don't know if Finn's brave enough as a government employee at the moment to have a stab at this, but it is a really interesting and important question.
I mean, I certainly won't comment on political will or marine spatial planning. I couldn't begin to answer that part of the question, but certainly the jurisdictional boundaries are very, very clear here in Australia. You know, we've got the New South Wales Marine Estate that runs out to exactly 3 nautical miles from the shore, and then extends out from a few of the islands that are in federal waters but offshore from New South Wales. It's then 3 nautical miles from their coast. You know, I think the state jurisdiction is that in every state, and the legislation that establishes it as such, if memory is serving me right, is from quite early in the 20th century. So it's been like this for a long time, and I don't think those jurisdictional facts are going to change anytime soon. I also think it's worth remembering that though we're not a massively populous country, we are a country with a lot of territory that needs to get managed by any planning system. And so, you know, I think the fact that planning has typically been a state concern is probably partly driven by those geographical challenges. So I can't see it changing anytime soon. And if it did, I would be very interested to see how you would hope to centralize any kind of planning process for Australia.
Okay. Well, on that thought, I'm going to bring this webinar to a close. I'd like to thank our 3 presenters who've done an excellent job on showing a lot of commonality and overlap while coming from very different perspectives, but also providing a lot of diversity in their thinking and experience, which gives us much to learn from. I'd also like to thank the triumvirate of Vanessa, Laura and Leslie, who have worked behind the scenes to actually make this event happen, and the nearly 300 of you that joined the call. So we had 3, 3 and 300. So that's a nice pyramid to ponder on. And with that, I'll bring this to a close. Thank you very much, everybody.
Is everyone?
Thanks, Chris. Thanks, everyone.